Awesome. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our Droplet Workshop on creating a revisions workflow. I am Shanna Pilcher. I am the Customer Education Manager here at Droplet. My job is to try and make using Droplet an easier process for you and to help you get the most out of our platform. So if you have any questions, if you find yourself looking for answers to things, we do have documentation on our support site here, support.droplet.io. I'm going to add some things into the chat, helpful links and maybe some logic later on here. But if you need some support and want a question, have a question in your mind, feel free to check out that support.droplet.io website. You can also access it directly from our platform. Any of our help articles are available for you to search here. And this is also where you will submit any support tickets that you might have with any issues that pop up. And we do have upcoming trainings that I will drop into the chat now. If you are interested in any of the upcoming trainings, feel free to register. I'd love to see you there. We repeat 3 of them monthly and then kind of do a new one or a rotating one. So feel free to check that out. So today we're going through the revisions workflow, how to send it back to the submitter for them to make some changes on their form. So we'll go over the routing portion. This will also involve adding conditions to your workflow and displaying the reason for when you reject. A box pops up for you to enter in the reasons that you are rejecting, how to display that, and then if you want to add any notifications alerting people to this revision. So let's get started. I want to go over a few workflow basics while we're here. So I am going to be working through just one of these forms that I identify that maybe a reimbursement form. So here we have, I'm going to open up the builder. Feel free to follow along as you are doing, as you're watching this workshop. Open up one of your own forms that you'd like to implement this revisions workflow, and let's work on it together. If you have questions that pop up while I am working through this, put them in the chat or feel free to unmute yourself and ask those questions. I'm sure it will be relevant to other people. So don't hesitate to ask. I would love to support any questions that you have. It looks like I already have a submission or a version of this form that's in draft that I can work on. If I did not, if I just had a published version, it would look like this. And I might want to create a new draft here. Okay, and I'm double checking that the form I selected does not have a revision workflow already in place. Okay, so from this version, let me just create a new draft. I don't know what was happening on that previous draft, but I know what I need to do right now. So let's take a look at the workflow and go over some basics here. So a workflow is triggered when the workflow pathways and transitions are all triggered whenever a button is selected. So if I take a look kind of at this debug or preview of the form here, anytime you click submit, there are no errors. It's going to trigger the workflow. If I were to move on to a different step, I have another button here available to me, this reject button. So these are the 2 ways that we trigger pathways within Droplet. And depending on which one is selected determines the pathways that are moving based on what you've set up here. So a lot of times we have a reject pathway that just goes to this rejected step. It just kind of halts everything, says, you know, we can't continue with this form. Either it's just not approved or there are too many issues on it and we need them to restart. But adding in a revision pathway gives you the opportunity to send it to the right person to make those changes and then continue it forward in the workflow. So we determine where the submission moves based on these pathways here, all of these lines that move from one to the next, and then based on those triggers. So the submit button being selected would be this check mark. Anytime it's submitted, it would move in this pathway. And this is a fairly linear workflow is what I would call it, because it doesn't have a lot of options here. Like it doesn't say go to either this step or this step. Delete that. Oops. I'm going to refresh because I didn't save and get that pathway back that I accidentally deleted. Perfect. The other option is to add a rejection pathway. So whenever that reject button is clicked, which would be, it's not available on the start step, but any further steps that reject would be visible. So I can add a different pathway than going to this rejected if I wanted to. For this case, we want to send it back to the start, send it back for revisions. So I am going to hover over, so I click into a step, I can hover over this reject pathway, and I can click and drag until it matches up with the start step. So now I have a new pathway that is available when reject is selected to go back to the start. So the first thing we want to do when we are creating our revision pathway is identifying who is able to send that revision. So what steps should be allowed to send it for revisions and what steps shouldn't. In this case, I want both of these steps to have the option to send it back to the start. So I identify the pathway, click the plus and drag it back to the start to give us that pathway. Now we'll get back into the details because we will need to have conditions now that there are two different pathways that it can go when reject is clicked. So it could either go to the rejected or it could go back to the start, and we need a way to tell the form I want it to go to the start step when this condition is met. Otherwise, I just want it to go to rejected. So I've created those pathways. Another thing we'll need to do, this start step is unassigned. Usually it's, you know, by the person filling out based on the URL that you give them, or they click it in your organization's internal website. They're able to access the form, complete it, and submit it without being assigned the form. But if it goes back to them, we need to make sure that we have an assignment there. So I can click directly on this unassigned dropdown, and I can click submitter here. This will assign it to whoever submitted it. And we're able to get those because Droplet requires this submitted by name and submitted by email fields to gather that information. So they just collect it, call it the submitter, and then that's variable depending on who is filling it out at that time. Okay. I've got a question here in the chat. When rejected, can we edit the form without having to resubmit a new one? Yes, that's exactly what we're doing in this revision workflow. So we can set up to reject, and it sends it back to the start step to whoever submitted the form to make the edits that you require of them. So if I click reject, I can say, you know, please fix reimbursement time. On this one, I select done. And then hopefully the way that we set up the revision workflow will go back to the start step. I hope that answers your question. And I hope it gets more clear how it works as we're going along here. But feel free to keep asking questions. So we've identified what steps can send it back to the start. We've added those pathways in the workflow, and we've assigned the start step, the submitter, assigned the start step a person to complete that information, which would be the submitter. So if I move forward, now we want to add conditions. So we need to tell the form, hey, I want it to go on this pathway back to the start when whatever we've identified here. And what our team often does, and which I'm going to show you how to do, is add in a radio button here that we call, next action. And it needs to be filled out before the approver can submit or reject the form at all. And I'm going to give it a few options here. So one would be approve. Another would be send back for revisions. And I'm going to say send back to, and this is what we call string interpolation. So 2 hashtags on each side of a field ID, a component ID here, which we call submitted by name, I believe is what we call it. Yep. So that will grab whatever they enter in here and put it into that option. So it'll say send back to Shanna for revisions. And I need to write that for revisions. And then another option to, let's just say reject submission. We'll call it that. You can also say permanently reject if that makes more sense and would be more clear for the people filling out your form. Just going to change the width on that real quick. And I am going to change this ID to be called approval actions, because I'll need that ID when I am doing the logic. So I'm just saving as I go. Okay. So I've added this. This will give whoever is approving the ability to decide whether to send it back for revisions or reject it or approve. And I need to make sure that that's visible to the right people. So here on the start step, I can see it's visible. I don't want it to be visible on the start step. I do want it to be editable on the office step. And same with this business manager step. I want it to be editable for them. If I save those options, I also would like to add some more action buttons to give myself a little bit more control over what people are selecting from this radio and what is given to them as far as options for submitting or rejecting. Because if they have both options after they select approve and they accidentally select reject, it just gets a little bit confusing. So I want to give them the option that they have selected here. This one I am going to leave, and I'm going to put all of this. I've got some things already worked out with logic into the chat here, so we can copy and paste those. It doesn't look as clear. Let me try that again and add in some. I did the same thing. Okay. I'm going to add in some spaces so that it's a little bit more clear what we are looking for at each point. Submit. Okay, that might look a little bit better. Okay, so I'm basically added in some display logic for each button that we want available. So we want an approve button, we want a send back to the submitter button, and we want a button when it's just rejected. And we want those very clear. And then I want just the regular options for my start step. I don't think they need the ability to reject. They should not have the ability to reject in what makes sense for this specific form. And I'm going to put some logic here. This one I did not add, but I will. So I'm going to say if the current step is start. So I am only giving access to these buttons for the start step. So let me copy this and I'll put it in the chat. Okay, done. I'm saving. Putting this into our chat. And then I kind of want to demonstrate what that would look like with just that one action button. You can see only submit is available. If I move to the office step now, I don't have any action buttons, even when I click these options. So I want to add an action button for each of those. Okay, so I come down to, I can either search for action buttons, or I can scroll there all the way on the bottom. I'm going to drag those over and add this. For this one, I don't want the reject. I can, I can center these if I want to. So this one will only be for approving, and I'm going to change the text to say approve. So that matches what we already put into the radio. And then I'm going to add in that display logic that I put into the chat for the submit button. So this is just like a template. So what I'm doing here is I'll change the steps that this should be visible on. And they might be called step 1, step 2, I'm not sure. So I'm going to come back to that. I'm going to take a look at my workflow to see what they are called. And I do need to find that inside of the code editor. So I toggled over to the code editor. I select the workflow tab because that's what I'm looking for. And then I want this ID for each of these. So this ID is called office step, and the other one is business manager step. So I come back for these action buttons. I'm going to go back into this office step, and then it was business manager step. This is saying, the first part of this is saying right here, if the step that this submission is on is the office step or the business manager step, I can display this. And then it's also checking this double and sign is saying, I want it to check that it's the right step, and I want to make sure that the selection is correct here. So if it says approve submission, and I can change this to be matching that approve submission. So if the approval actions, which is how we identify this component here, if the selection is approve submission, I will display this action here, which says approve. Approval actions, approve submission. Done. So if I save that, I can come over to my debug view, which you access from the 3-dot menu to debug. I can switch it over to the office step. You can see I don't have any actions, but if I select approve submission, that approve button pops up for me. And I want to do the same thing with more action buttons. So that was just for approve submission option. Now I want to kind of make this align the same way. I don't want it to have submit. I just want it to have the reject. And I want it to say the same thing, send back to double hashtag submitted by name, closing with the double hashtag for revisions. We'll see how the button handles all of that text. But I kind of wanted it to match what's selected here so people understand what they are clicking. And then I want to add display logic again. So the same thing, but I'm changing the second part of that statement to say that approval actions, I want this to display when the send back to submitted by name for revisions is clicked or is selected. And I need to put my steps there. I'm going to leave that for just a second, and I'm going to copy over what I've already entered here. Paste that. Done. Save, and I can check that, but I'm going to do this last action button before I do another test. So I'm going to add one more. On the bottom, this will also not be a submit. It'll just be the reject option, and this will say reject submission. I'm adding in that display logic I added to the chat. I'm gonna paste what I've already put, those step names, so that I don't lose that again. Paste it, and then I can take that out and paste it here. This one, I accidentally had extra quotes. That looks better. Okay, so again, checking that it's the right steps, and then it's checking that the correct selection was made on that approval actions radio right here. If I save that, I can come back in here and refresh the page. So now I'm going to test that I have the right information. So if I do business manager, we'll test this one now. I click approve submission. It says approve there. I click send back to for revisions, and it shows. So I might change the text because it looks like it's getting cut off a little bit. And if I select reject submission, then that shows as well. Okay, so we have it set up inside the layout of kind of what we want our conditions to look like. Now we need to make that match inside of our workflow. If I come to the workflow, I'm going to select the office step because I have two options for this reject whenever reject is selected. And I need to define what when it will go to start and when it will go to rejected. So I'm clicking on the office step. I'm going to select details here. And I want this order is important. So it's going to check number 1 first. If it doesn't meet number 1's conditions, then it'll default to number 2. But I want it to check the start step first. So I'm dragging that using these navigation area right here. And I click to create logic. The logic that I want, I've added into the chat, but I'll do it again. So I want it to send to the start step when this is selected. So kind of the same thing that we set up when we were adding those actions, but this time it's telling the workflow, hey, if somebody selects this option and then clicks the reject button, even though it says something different, it's still the reject button. I want it to go to the start step. If it's not that, it'll default to rejected if the rejected button is selected. But if approve is selected, it goes to the business manager, and there's no other options here, so I don't need to add any conditions there. So I did that for the first one, and this step also has the option to send it for revision, so I'm going to do the same thing here. Drag that up so the start is the first thing that's checked, and I'm going to put in that display or put in that logic to check that it's the right selection to send it back to the start. I click done and save. So now our layout and our workflow are working together. Okay. Another thing we might want to do is that if I were to select send back for revisions, I click this button, this box pops up. Reason for rejecting. So it says this reason may be shared with the requester. It won't be shared unless we share it. So this is probably important for anybody that is revising. They're like, okay, I got this submission back, but I don't know what to fix on here. This is where you would explain what to fix. Fix this field to be that. Just a very generic thing. I want to be able to let the submitter know what I put into that box. And the way that we can do this, we can do it in a couple different ways. One would be to add in text, and I like to add it to the just right underneath the heading of the form. I'm going to expand it all the way to 12. I'm going to put this into the chat. This is often what we use when our team is creating this revisions workflow. We'll say this submission was flagged for corrections. Please ensure the following issues have been addressed. And this will notify the submitter and then anybody in the process after that there have been corrections, and we need to check to make sure that those corrections have been made. I'm going to make this red. Okay, I can change size if I want to. This looks fine to me. And the other thing we want to do is we only want this to display when it has been rejected. So I'm going to put in the chat. This is display logic that I can use. Here it's saying the type of, and this underscore reason is that box that pops up. That's what we are able to identify it as. So the identifier for this box is called underscore reason. So if it's not undefined, meaning that nothing has been entered into it, and it's not for the completed or rejected, I want it to display. Done. I can save that. And here I'm going to refresh and I'm going to test it out. So I'm going to put my name in here because that's important in our process, because these actions use that name in here. So I'm going to send it back to me for revisions. I click that button. You forgot. Please add your last name. Please add your last name. Click done. And when it gets sent back to the start step, and that did not work. So that's why we test. because I just put underscore reason without adding the hashtags around it. The hashtags are the way to grab the information from that field. Click out and save. Let's try that again. Send back for revisions. I click button. Please add your last name. Done. Navigate back to the start step, and it's still showing the reason. It grabbed a lot of additional things here, which I did not need it to do. That's why it didn't see that they were. Underscore reason. Okay. Now that I fixed that a little bit, it's showing as a dynamic value. This should work. Third time's the charm. Put my name in here. Yeah, I can add more information if I wanted to, but I just want to test this thing. Please add your last name. Done. Go back to the start step. And now it is showing the reason that I put in here. So me as the submitter, I'll see this. I'll be like, oh yeah, I did not put my last name. I can add my last name here. And then resubmit the form, and it'll go back in the regular workflow that we have set up. Okay. The last thing that we could do, and that's just dependent on your process, is I can come in here to the workflow and say, hey, when it comes into the start step, or when it's assigned to the submitter here, I want to change what it says here. I want to say revisions requested for, and here I can add the form name. I don't have to type it out. I can just simply say form name there from our dynamic fields. Hi, that works fine. Here I want to say something else. Please submit this form again after making the requested changes. And here I can also put in that rejection reason. And then the click to review as well. So then they would get a notification that makes sense because revisions are requested. And I'm giving them that information inside the notification as well as inside the form. Okay. And that's kind of how a revisions workflow would be set up. Again, this is Droplet workflows and layouts are set up to be very flexible. So there are multiple ways that you can do a revisions workflow. This is the way that I would always suggest it because we want to keep the integrity of your approvals in this process. by letting them know when changes have been made and then giving people the ability to review to make sure that those changes have been made and continue the approval process. If you have questions, I'm going to stop the recording here.